Reddit. What parts of your family history is interesting? Interesting, if not incredibly sad. I had a great-great-grandma, or aunt, can't remember, who had 13 children out of wedlock, all by different men. She was nicknamed Notoriously Loose Julie by her town. The doctor told her not to have any more children after the 12th, but she did so, and both her and that baby died. The community felt she was such a stain on the town's reputation they refused to bury her in the town cemetery. Back in the old days, small town. That is a very sad story. Grandfather had an affair with my grandmother's sister. He got her pregnant, and when the little boy turned 7, he went to live with my grandparents, and they raised him as their own. The pain my grandmother must have felt is insane. I didn't learn this until this year at 36. My grandpa and my great uncle both slept with my grandma's sister, and we still have no idea whose the resulting child is. Neither really wants to claim her, as she's bat crap insane, but from me looks, she fits in perfectly with my great uncle's family. My Swedish ancestors arrived to Australia by boat. When they arrived, one of them got crushed by a crate that fell off a crane on the docks. He made it all the way and didn't even get to set foot in Australia. Capital F. My grandfather is an identical twin. During World War II he joined the military and his twin took his place at his job. Grandfather got out of the army, made up a new name he's been going by since. That's some Don Draper crap. Women in my family have been going to college for 7 generations, since the 1840s. Most of them have master's degrees. Also, one of these women, either my G-grandma or my GG-grandma, was involved in the first car wreck in her city as a teenager when she stole her parents' car and drove it into a horse-drawn buggy. A legend. I thought you were stuttering in the brackets. There were 2 Tillys on the Mayflower that I could potentially be very distant relatives to. Apparently a prostitute and a horse thief. Elizabeth Tilley is my 14th great-grandmother. No word on her profession or penchants for equine thievery. My great-grandfather came over from Germany with his wife. They had 1 child, but her second was an ectopic pregnancy, which killed her. So he brought her older sister over from Germany and made her wife 2.0. I have pictures of my great-great-grandpa, great-grandpa, regular old grandpa and dad. They look exactly alike. You couldn't tell them apart. My dad just had girls, but my sister has a son and he looks exactly like my dad. They all look like a William Shatner and Clint Eastwood combo. The male genes are strong in our family. ETA, all the girls in our family look like their mothers. My sister and I are a carbon copy of our mum. My aunts look nothing like my grandpa. If I was standing next to my dad, you'd never know we were related. It's like the DNA said I have 1 job and 1 job only. Picture. My great-grandfather was born on the same day as my sister, exactly 100 years ahead of her. August of 1899 versus 1999. He went on to fight in the Great War and was one of the few members of the Newfoundland Regiment to avoid being slaughtered at the Somme. He went AWOL to marry my great-grandmother. His son, my great-uncle, fought in North Africa in the British Army. He was the sole survivor of an unfortunate incident involving an artillery tractor meeting a Panzer IV. He made it through the war with mere cuts and bruises. He lived to be 97. Hello fellow Newf. One of my great-something grandfathers was Thomas Wolsey, the cardinal over England during the reign of Henry VIII and the guy who attempted to get the Pope to let Henry divorce Catherine of Aragon. Apparently I came from one of the bastard children he fathered with Joan Lark. Bastard. I am biracial. Black father, white mother. My mom's father was in the KKK and actually appeared on 60 Minutes in the late 80s or early 90s regarding that group. Imagine being in the KKK and your daughter marries a black guy. My great-grandfather was conscripted by the Nazis and rose to an officer. He was captured by the Soviets and forced into hard labor in a Siberian gulag. He escaped toward the end of the war and used Russian he knew from living in Belarus as a child to make his way back to Germany. The Catholic Church moved him to the States after the war, where his son, my grandfather, accepted a job for the DoD fitting triggers for nukes and married the daughter, my grandmother, of a US naval officer from the war. This story was passed only a few times because he refused to discuss any events of the war up until his death. Could be all bulls, but I still tell it like it's all true. Very few pictures remain. That is scarily close to the same exact story my grandmother tells me about her father. Odd. I'm related to John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln. There's a family legend that John actually survived the manhunt and lived in a family attic until he died of old age. There are also various other escape theories running about. When my family tried to get the bones of the body the US government claims is John Wilkes tested, a judge first denied exhumation. There are 3 vertebrae being kept by the US Army Medical Command, and they also denied permission, claiming that the test, which would require less than 0.4 grams of bone, would be too destructive. That's so weird. Being related to a historical figure while also being related to their color. That's actually kinda cool, and I wonder how it ended up like that. My paternal great-grandparents were members of the Dutch resistance against the occupying Nazi forces. My grandmother has told me stories about it, including one about her having breakfast with a strange man at the table who was deaf and was to be ignored. When Nazi soldiers came by in raids on my grandmother's house, my great-grandparents would hide the Allied soldiers in their cellar, and my great-grandmother would put a rug over the cellar door and stand on it while the Nazis searched the house. My great-grandfather was almost shot to death by the Nazis in a random killing of townspeople, but was able to talk his way out of it as he was fluent in German. The first time my grandmother ever had chocolate was immediately after the liberation of the Netherlands, when Canadian and American forces brought food back to the villages and towns in the Netherlands. Your paternal great-grandparents are heroes. I can't even imagine the terror of having Nazi soldiers invade your home. The men who hid people in their homes certainly put their whole family in harm's way, an understatement for sure, but I so admire their strength to do the right thing. What an incredible legacy to follow. On my father's side of the family, we can count at least 100 teachers in our family from post-Civil War to present day. It must be in our blood. Both of my grandparents are from Germany and both come from completely opposite sides of the Holocaust. My grandfather on my father's side of the family served in Hitler's army. According to my dad, he wasn't exactly a Nazi, as he was more so just taking orders from them. And supposedly he had no idea where the Jews were being taken when the SS started rounding them up. When he found out what was really going on, he defected to the Allies and barely made it out of the war alive. Eventually he found himself in America, married my grandma, and had my dad. My grandfather on my mother's side of the family is a Jew who fled to Brazil and still lives there today. I don't know much about what happened on his side of the story, as according to my mom, he hates talking about it. So by my guess he must have had a really tough time. It was all really mind-blowing for me, as both my grandparents died when I really young. And I didn't find about any of this until I took a World War II history class in high school, and my dad teased my mom about it, saying, "Hear that, hon? Our boy is going to learn how to deal with dirty Jews like you." I can only imagine what would be said if the two met up at a family reunion or something. I'm a direct descendant of Robert the Bruce. Also, one of my ancestors lived in Shetland and cured the whole island and Orkney of smallpox with his own homemade remedy that didn't involve cowpox at all. How do you even trace back that far? My family history fizzles out after 4 generations. I'm related to Thomas Ridgway, who was the owner of the most famous tea company in England. I think he was also knighted as well. I'm both Austrian and Italian, but also neither of those. My ancestors immigrated from a place that was technically Austria. They wrote Austria on all their paperwork, but now it's Italy. My ancestors would tell you they were Italian. Anyways, I should be eligible for Italian citizenship by blood, but when I applied, they essentially said no, you're Austrian. So I attempted the same in Austria. Their reply, no, you're Italian. Confused, said Blackman JPG. Same, it was Austria and my relatives from there as well. DNA genotype just says N European. My grandpa's side of the family lost all their things in a war, rebuilt their life only for a second war to come and lose everything again in Palestine. That forced my grandpa to move to the UAE and provide for all of his family, brothers, sisters and parents, and then starting a family. And then once his kids were teenagers, the Gulf War happened and he was separated from his kids and wife. They reunited and were kinda poor but ended up making good income. My dad is now doing really well and money isn't really an issue. Grandparents on both sides were adopted. My grandmother was adopted by her paternal aunt. Didn't actually meet her dad until she was 20. My grandfather on the other side was a late in life baby. His mother had a son a little older than him from another marriage and his dad had daughters from his first wife. When his parents both passed, he was 10 years old. His half-sister on his dad's side adopted both him and his half-brother. On my father's side, I am the descendant of George Custer. Yes, the one who killed and was killed by the Native Americans. On my mother's side, my grandmother is half Cherokee Indian. Well, that's awkward. My mom told me that my grandpa, her dad, who is 82 right now, had an uncle who would steal cattle back in the early 1900s or so. This was a common crime back in the Wild West. She also told me that he was shot in the leg one time running away from some cattle owners but was able to get away. On an unrelated incident, my mom's grandpa was really young riding horseback somewhere around La Grande, Oregon, when they came across a gentleman who had been lynched. The men responsible for the lynching told them to turn around and go back where they came from or else they'd end up on that tree. Kind of interesting how this really isn't that long ago when you think about it. I probably have the factor wrong, but somewhere around my 8x great uncle was President James Buchanan, the US's only bachelor president who was most likely gay and hands down the worst president in our history. What about President Sir Lord Quentin Tremblay III, Esquire? My mother's family came over to America before the revolution. My mother's generation is the first to speak English exclusively. My father was born and raised in SC by an Irish traveller family. The Cant was his first language. Gullah was his second. English is his third. He's also very white. Whoa, you taught me something really interesting today. I had no idea something called the Cant existed. What a rabbit hole. Thank you. On my grandmother's side, a relative's family was massacred in the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Hitchcock Road, which leads into Hitchcock Canyon, was named after my great-great-great-grandfather Don Jose. My grandmother's mother's aunt, I believe, died on Titanic after hanging onto the side of a life raft for quite some time. Someone tried to pull her up but didn't succeed, and she died. However, her ring slipped off and ended up in the bottom of the raft. Nobody in the raft survived since it was out on the sea for weeks during storms etc. The rings got tracked back to Sweden and are now in possession of my grandmother, who used to bring them to different Titanic exhibitions. The raft's lifeboats weren't at sea for weeks. They were all recovered within 12 hours of the Titanic's last known communication. Apparently, my great-great-grandfather found a cave system near the town city he lived in, and my cousin is a footballer, soccer player, who used to play for Swansea. Some of my family moved to Nebraska in the late 1800s to be a part of an Irish-American community. Said community was started by a guy who was a part of a group of people who tried to take Canada from the British on behalf of the United States. Late, but figure I would comment anyways. My grandmother was 100% Native American as stated on her birth certificate. Her grandfather was a chieftain, and his picture is in the Smithsonian Museum. However, when my father took a DNA test, the results reported he was only about 2% Native American. It was baffling for the entire family. He should be 50%. It claimed we were mostly European. One of my sisters had similar results. My dad is not adopted. He resembles his siblings and parents a lot. We figure it's likely a case of our particular tribe not being documented on the website. However, another interesting theory we had is this. The tribe we descend from, Lumbee, is from North Carolina. What is in North Carolina? The lost colony of Roanoke. It is a famous theory that the Roanoke people integrated with the Lumbee tribe. We looked up records of surnames from the Roanoke settlement and found our ancestors' last name in it. It may or may not be true. but it's really fun to theorize and tell people about. Half of my family left for the USA during the end of the 19th century. The ones that stayed had to fight through the Spanish Civil War. They survived the bombings in Guernica. Yes, the one portrayed by Picasso in his famous painting. After the war, some left and lived through the German occupation of France and the air raids in England. The ones in England survived. The ones in France died either fighting or in concentration camps. I'd say those that left early and went to the USA got the best part of it. We were rich as frick in the late 1800s to the Great Depression. We made most of the iron used for manufacturing oil and refineries as well as ornate gates. They started making those in the 1600s in Germany. Great Depression came and my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather sold all of their holdings at the very bottom. The other half of the family held 30%. 20% was stolen from them and never spoke to this side again. My great-grandmother got a job brushing horses at the stables her parents used to own. My great-grandfather drank away the remaining money. They buried my grandfather's little brother in an unmarked grave somewhere in Philadelphia when he died and told everyone he was buried by the state, which was found out to be a lie when the grave of the John Doe they claimed was him turned out to be a 9-year-old boy identified 30 years later. Of my grandfather's other 7 siblings, only one never went to prison or a mental institution. Of my grandmother's 6, only one didn't. We later found out my grandfather's dad had at least 3 bastard children no one knew about. Family legend says Ted Bundy might be one, as Jack Worthington was the name he used to get work at a shipyard to hide his record. Jack Worthington is also the name Ted Bundy's mom once gave as to who his father was, who she met at a shipyard. We also have a family curse which guarantees you'll die old unless murdered or in an accident. All this since 1850 make it to 80. Most live to 90. 13 I know of made 100. So long as you don't die before your 30th birthday, which is almost 50/50. Only exceptions are 2 brothers who died in their 40s of the same unknown illness in 1690, a few days apart. In the 1600s most made it to their 70s, with a few 80s and one guy rumored to have died at 101. That curse is peculiarly specific. My great-great-uncle founded a town on Lake Mead. It's underwater now, but there's a marina there that goes by our family name. Not sure if I believe it or not, but my grandma is adamant that one of our ancestors was a princess of the Seminole tribe in Florida. This was a really common story back in the day when a white woman birthed a suspiciously dark-skinned child. Letting a Native American knock you up was frowned upon, but not as bad as having a black man's child. My dad worked with Chuck Yeager in the Air Force. He died when I was 5, so I never got to hear his experience with him. My great-grandfather beat up a member of the Purple Gang in their height in the 1930s. He was working at a hotel and the man attempted to steal his wallet. Him being a poor immigrant, he wouldn't have much in the wallet. But, being a skilled boxer, when the man attempted to steal it, he flipped him over and landed a few punches. The manager then told him that he had to leave Detroit. Detroit was Purple Gang territory, because they had guys waiting outside the hotel. When my family came to America somewhere around the late 1800s, early 1900s, we added an O onto the front of our name to make it sound Irish. Everyone was giving low-paying jobs to the Irish and it was an easy way to get a job at the time. Alright, O Sanchez, come back tomorrow ready to work. My family used to own a good chunk of modern-day New York City, including Central Park, Harlem, and the area around Wall Street. The Dutch side of my family settled in New Amsterdam during the early days of the city. Eventually my family decided to lease the land to settlers for a period of 99 years, and at the end of the lease the land would revert back to my family. By the time this arrangement was over, most people had forgotten about it. So land ownership was deeded by New York to the people who occupied the land. Then, in the early 20th century, the old lease resurfaced and was said to be in the possession by a member in my family inserting court records, which conveniently disappeared before hearings on this matter. From here the story becomes drawn out, so I'll cut to the good part, which is that obviously the land that my family owned in New York City was pretty much priceless, so you basically couldn't put a price tag on it. So, eventually the city agreed to form a committee and meet with members of my family annually until an agreement on a paycheck could be made. Apparently this went on for decades where no side in the family could agree on a price tag, so they ended negotiations which led to no one supposedly getting any money. There was a rumor for years that since no one could agree on a price, a few family members made an under-the-table agreement with the city for a good sum paycheck, which is the reason they stopped negotiations. There was also another problem. The only way that they could have ended up with money after this ordeal was if they could provide the city with the original lease. Well, it turns out the house which the lease had supposedly been sitting in had been burned down. But hey, maybe the lease wasn't in that house and maybe it will be found someday in somebody's attic. So, there you have it. That's the story about how my family could have been billionaires. TLDR. Family owned most of New York City's land, ended up with nothing in the end. My grandparents got divorced after having 2 kids, my mom and uncle, and my grandma had a baby girl with someone she met in Germany, cause she moved to Germany, then my grandpa was stationed in Germany, so they met back up and then got remarried, and then my grandpa adopted my aunt. I learned about this 2 months ago. Also, I don't know if this counts, but I'm a descendant of Christopher Columbus. Fun. I don't know why, but the indigenous blood in me is asking me to sacrifice you right now. By some really lengthy explanation that took a ton of family tree tracing, my mother's side of the family is related to Princess Diana, and my ancestors can be traced back to the first settlers on the Mayflower. Also, I'm a descendant of the McCoy family in the Hatfield-McCoy rivalry. Hey, my family is on the Hatfield side. Granny Hatfield, Devil Ance's mother, was the midwife attending the birth of my grandmother. Get your blunderbuss, ma. I found another one of those McCoys. My surname technically does not exist. 60% of my family was killed in concentration camps during World War II. The rest of them escaped to England. We changed the spelling of our surname and adopted more English letters such as S instead of Z and spelled the name differently. As far as I have found, there are only 6 families with this surname in England and they are direct descendants of the original family. Don't know exactly, but my, let's say, great-great-great-great-grandpa, don't know how many generations back, they were Chinese, but when they got to America they had to say their birthday, which is treated differently in China I guess. So he chose his own birthday, the 1st of January, so we always have Chinese food on New Year's. In the traditional Chinese age reckoning system, a child is considered to be a year old at birth, and everyone turns another year older on the Lunar New Year, so it makes perfect sense he would use the Western New Year as his birthday. I'm part Portuguese, but I've only ever known myself to be black. I recently saw some ancestors on my mom's side and those MFs are definitely Portuguese. Now it makes sense why my mom and her mother are so light-skinned, almost looking white. I don't know anything the Portuguese part of my family. What's also interesting is that my dad's side of the family is from Jackson, Mississippi. I have his complexion, which is similar to, let's say Denzel Washington. My dad's father moved to St. Louis long before my generation was born. Apparently, he changed our last name from Schumacher, SP, to Davis. Interesting name change. From Mississippi. Does my family have slave history? I'm 34 now and didn't really have much curiosity until the last few years. Now I want to understand more, because it has literally felt like my entire family history began with my grandparents on both sides. And of course that's no true. A lot of former slaves took the last name of their masters, so that is possible. There's a white shoemaker family here who have kinda always had money and could quite possibly have had slaves. My grandfather was one of the founders of the first National Police School and Syndicate. He also served as an officer in a certain South African country and a certain Atlantic island. He and my grandmother were also the latest people on my mom's side of the family to see snow in our town, since it hasn't snowed in some 70 to 80 years here, and before that, who knows? Unlikely it'll ever happen again, sadly. It was all downhill from there really. My great uncle was in a mining accident at age 20 and was in the hospital for over a year. This is the 1920s and had his legs partially amputated. After getting out of the hospital, he bought a small farmhouse and farmed. He bought a child's wheelchair so he could garden sitting in it, and did it until he died 6 decades later. My great X2 grandmother went missing with a herd of goats. She came back in the spring with cheese and butter. She was a beast. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.